"Get away from her," Dennis said quietly. He didn't shout. He didn't pull a weapon. But the chilling, absolute authority in his gravelly voice acted like liquid nitrogen in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. 100 of New York's most dangerous elites froze instantly. Victor's fingers dug painfully into Bridget's thick, soft arm, but at the sound of the Mafia Boss's voice, the color drained from his face. No one breathed. The king had finally claimed his queen. Chandeliers dripped with thousands of Austrian crystals, casting a shattered, glittering light over the charity gala hosted within the legendary walls of the Pierre Hotel. It was an event dripping in high society glamour and under-the-table corruption. To the untrained eye, it was a gathering of Wall Street titans, politicians, and philanthropists. To those in the know, it was a neutral ground for the 5 ruling families of the East Coast to negotiate their blood-soaked territories over glasses of Dom Perignon. Bridget Hill stood near a towering ice sculpture, feeling entirely out of place, yet refusing to shrink herself to fit the room. She was a fat woman in a sea of razor-thin socialites and meticulously sculpted mob wives. Where they wore restrictive, backless slips of fabric, Bridget was draped in a magnificent, custom-tailored emerald silk gown. It hugged her generous curves, accentuated her waist, and flowed elegantly over her wide hips. She knew she took up space, and after years of apologizing for her existence, she had finally learned to wear her body like armor. Her dark hair was pinned up in loose, elegant waves, and a bold swipe of crimson lipstick completed the look. She looked like a Renaissance painting brought to vivid, breathing life, but her confident exterior masked a frantically beating heart. "You think you can just walk away from my family, B?" Victor Rossi hissed, his breath hot and reeking of scotch against her neck. Victor was the hot-headed underboss of the Rossi syndicate, a man who possessed a handsome face entirely ruined by the cruelty in his dark eyes. He had cornered her between the ice sculpture and a heavy velvet drape. His fingers clamped down on her fleshy upper arm, bruising the skin beneath the emerald silk. "Let go of me, Victor," Bridget said, keeping her voice low but remarkably steady. She refused to let him see her tremble. "The catering contract is finished. My obligations to you are done." "Your obligations are done when I say they're done," Victor sneered, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical frame to intimidate her. "You saw things in that kitchen you weren't supposed to see. You think I'm just going to let a fat little baker walk out of here and talk to the feds?" "I haven't spoken to anyone," Bridget replied, her chin tilting up in defiance. "But if you don't unhand me, I will scream. And I guarantee the mayor over there will not appreciate the scandal." Victor laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The mayor works for my uncle. Scream all you want, sweetheart. You're leaving with me tonight, and we're going to have a long talk about what you found in the flour bins." He yanked her forward, causing Bridget to stumble slightly on her velvet heels. Panic, cold and sharp, finally began to pierce through her brave facade. She looked around the opulent ballroom. The guests, senators, judges wearing bespoke Tom Ford suits, women draped in Cartier diamonds, intentionally averted their eyes. In this world, you did not intervene in Rossi family business. Then the air in the room changed. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was instantaneous, as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped. The ambient hum of 100 conversations, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the soft tunes playing from the orchestra. It all died. Dennis Barlow had entered the immediate vicinity. He was a mountain of a man, clad in a perfectly tailored charcoal Brioni suit that did nothing to hide the lethal, coiled muscle beneath. As the head of the Barlow family, the most powerful and ruthless syndicate on the eastern seaboard, Denny commanded a terrifying level of respect. He had a strong, aristocratic profile, dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and a faint silver scar running from his left temple down to his jawline. A souvenir from a life he had brutally conquered. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a panther, parting the sea of frozen guests without needing to say a single word. Victor was entirely focused on Bridget, oblivious to the sudden silence until Denny was standing mere inches behind him. "Get away from her," Denny said quietly. He didn't shout. He didn't pull a weapon. But the chilling, absolute authority in his gravelly voice acted like liquid nitrogen in the grand ballroom. 100 of New York's most dangerous elites froze instantly. Victor stiffened, his spine snapping straight. The fingers digging into Bridget's arm loosened involuntarily. He turned around slowly, the smug arrogance melting off his face to reveal stark, unadulterated terror. "Don Denis," Victor stammered, taking a clumsy step back. I was just having a conversation with the caterer. Family business." Dennis's dark eyes flicked briefly to Bridget. His gaze softened for a microsecond, taking in her bruised arm, the defiant flush on her cheeks, and the absolute majesty of her in that green dress. Then his eyes locked back onto Victor, turning as hard and unforgiving as obsidian. "She is not a caterer tonight, Victor," Denny said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying across the dead silent room. "She is my guest, and you are putting your filthy hands on my guest." A collective gasp, so quiet it was almost a whisper, rippled through the onlookers. Denny Barlow was famously solitary. He never brought guests to these functions. He certainly never claimed them publicly. "I didn't know," Victor choked out, raising his hands in surrender. "My apologies, Dennis. It's a misunderstanding." "If you ever touch her again," Denny said, stepping into Victor's personal space, radiating a quiet, lethal malice, "I will not waste my breath speaking to you. I will simply remove the hands that offended me. Do we understand each other?" Victor nodded frantically, his face pale. Yes, Don Barlow." "Walk away." Victor practically scrambled backwards, disappearing into the crowd of stunned elites. Denny watched him for a moment before turning his full attention to Bridget. The terrifying mob boss melted away, leaving behind a man who looked at her with a mixture of reverence and deep concern. He slowly extended a large, calloused hand toward her. "Are you all right, Bridget?" he asked softly, using her full name. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. Bridget looked at his hand, then up into his dark eyes. Her heart, which had been beating in terror moments before, was now hammering an entirely different rhythm. She placed her soft, trembling hand into his large, firm one. "I am now," she whispered. "Then let's get out of here," Denny murmured, gently wrapping her arm through his. Without looking back, Dennis Barlow escorted the beautiful, plus-sized baker out of the grand ballroom. The 100 guests remained frozen, holding their breath until the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, fully aware that the political landscape of the New York underworld had just fundamentally shifted over a woman in an emerald dress. The truth of how Bridget Hill came to be on the arm of the city's most feared mafia boss started 6 months earlier in the warm, yeast-scented haven of her bakery, the Golden Crumb, nestled in a rapidly gentrifying corner of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Bridget was a master of her craft. She had built her business from the ground up, fighting through the prejudices of an industry that often judged a chef by their waistline rather than their palate. Bridget was unapologetically fat, and she loved food. She loved the science of it, the comfort of it, the way a perfectly laminated croissant could bring genuine joy to a person's morning. Her kitchen was her sanctuary, filled with the aroma of browned butter, Madagascar vanilla, and fresh espresso. Her talent was undeniable, which was precisely how she caught the attention of the Rossi family. They owned the building her bakery was in, and when they needed a caterer for their legitimate corporate events, Victor Rossi had strong-armed her into a contract. It was supposed to be simple: bake pastries, provide exquisite finger foods, and ask 0 questions. But Bridget had noticed the other patron who began frequenting her shop around the same time. Denny Barlow didn't look like a man who belonged in a quaint Brooklyn patisserie. He usually arrived at 6:30 a.m., just as she was unlocking the doors. He wore bespoke suits, carried a quiet, intimidating aura, and was always accompanied by 2 massive men who waited outside by a black SUV. The first time he walked in, Bridget had frozen, wiping flour off her apron over her wide hips, acutely aware of how messy she looked. But Denny hadn't sneered. He had simply walked up to the counter, looked at the dazzling array of pastries, and then looked directly at her. "Black coffee," he had said, his deep voice vibrating in her chest, "and whatever you are most proud of baking this morning." She had served him a slice of a complex, dark chocolate and blood orange tart. He had sat at a small corner table, eating it slowly, watching her work through the open kitchen window. He came back the next day, and the next. They rarely exchanged more than a few words, but a silent, intense understanding blossomed between them. He observed the way she moved around her kitchen, capable, strong, passionate. He watched how her eyes lit up when a customer loved a new recipe. For Denny, a man surrounded by betrayal, violence, and artificiality, Bridget was the most genuine, beautiful creature he had ever encountered. Her softness, her curves, the unapologetic space she occupied, it all anchored him. Bridget, in turn, found herself baking specific things just for him. She learned he hated overly sweet things, preferring rich, complex, savory, or dark flavors. She found herself looking forward to 6:30 a.m., blushing when his dark eyes lingered on her chest or the curve of her hips as she reached for a high shelf. He never looked at her with the condescending pity or fetishizing gaze she had encountered from other men. He looked at her like he was dying of thirst, and she was the only water source in the desert. But the sanctuary of her bakery had been shattered a week before the gala. Victor Rossi had increasingly used her catering vans to move untraceable cash. Bridget had suspected it, but she had kept her head down, prioritizing the safety of her staff and her livelihood. However, Victor was as careless as he was cruel. Late one Tuesday evening, while cleaning out the back of a catering van returned by Victor's men, Bridget found a false bottom in a carrying cooler. Inside wasn't just cash, it was a heavy, encrypted titanium flash drive. Curiosity and a desperate need to know how much danger she was in drove her to plug it into an old offline laptop at her apartment. She was no hacker, but Victor had stupidly taped the decryption password to the back of the drive itself, a testament to his arrogance. When the files opened, Bridget felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't just money laundering ledgers. It was a detailed list of judges, politicians, and police commissioners on the Rossi payroll, complete with offshore account routing numbers. Even worse, it contained blueprints and shipment schedules for the Barlow family's shipping ports in New Jersey. Victor was planning a massive, coordinated strike against Dennis's territory, hoping to cripple the rival family and take the throne for himself. Victor realized his mistake the next morning. He had stormed into her bakery, demanding the drive. Bridget, terrified but thinking quickly on her feet, had played the role of the oblivious, clumsy baker. She claimed the coolers had been washed and bleached, and she had seen nothing. Victor hadn't believed her, but he couldn't prove it. Since then, he had been stalking her, threatening her, waiting for her to slip up. He had forced her to attend the gala at the Pierre, threatening to burn the golden crumb to the ground with her staff inside if she didn't show up. It was a power play, a way to keep her under his thumb until he figured out what she knew. What Victor didn't know was that Bridget had not destroyed the drive, and she had not told the police. The police were on the Rossi payroll. She knew there was only one man in New York powerful enough to protect her, and ironically, it was the man who drank black coffee in her shop every morning. She just hadn't known how to give it to him without signing her own death warrant, until Denis stepped out of the shadows at the gala and claimed her as his own. The air outside the Pierre Hotel was thick with a humid, unseasonable autumn rain. The moment Denis and Bridget stepped past the gold-plated revolving doors, a fleet of black SUVs aggressively blocked the street, ignoring the angry honks of Fifth Avenue traffic. A massive man with a broken nose, Carmine, Dennis's right hand, held open the heavy door of a customized armored Mercedes Maybach. Denis guided Bridget inside, sliding in right beside her. The door slammed shut with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud, instantly cutting off the noise of the city and the driving rain. The interior of the Maybach was a cavern of cream-colored leather and polished walnut. It smelled of rich upholstery and Denise's subtle cedarwood cologne. Bridget sank into the plush seat, the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright suddenly crashing. She began to shake. It started in her hands and quickly overtook her whole body. She wrapped her arms around her waist, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to control her ragged breathing. Denis moved closer, closing the distance between them. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he took off his suit jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The jacket was massive on her, heavy and warm, carrying his scent. "Breathe, Bridget," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble in the quiet cabin. "You are safe. I swear on my life, Victor Rossi will never come within 100 yards of you again." She opened her eyes, looking at him. The streetlights from the city flashed through the tinted, bulletproof glass, illuminating the harsh lines of his face and the soft concern in his eyes. "Why did you do that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You just started a war in front of the entire city." Denis leaned back slightly, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the soft curve of her neck, down to the swell of her cleavage pushed up by the emerald gown. A war with the Rossis was inevitable. Victor is an ambitious, rabid dog, but I will admit, accelerating the timeline was not on my agenda for tonight. Then why? Denis reached out, his knuckles gently grazing the bruised skin on her arm, where Victor had grabbed her. His jaw clenched tight enough to snap bone. "Because he touched what is mine," he stated simply, as if stating a universal law of physics. Bridget's breath hitched. I'm not yours. I'm just a baker." A ghost of a smile touched Dennis's lips. "You haven't been just a baker to me since the first morning I walked into your shop, and you handed me a pastry with flour on your nose. But we can argue about semantics later. Right now, we need to get you out of the city." He pressed a button on the intercom. "Carmine, the Catskills safe house. Do not take the main highways." "Yes, boss," the driver's voice crackled back. The Maybach surged forward, slicing through the rainy New York night. As they drove in silence, The bright lights of Manhattan slowly gave way to the darker, winding roads of upstate New York. The tension in the car was palpable, heavy with unspoken questions and a crackling, undeniable chemistry. Bridget was hyper-aware of his thigh resting inches from hers, the heat radiating from his large frame. After 2 hours of driving through twisting, forested mountain roads, the Maybach approached massive wrought-iron gates hidden entirely from the main road by thick pines. The gates swung open automatically, revealing a stunning, modern fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone built into the side of the mountain. It was brutalist, beautiful, and completely impenetrable. Once inside the massive garage, Denny helped her out of the car. He kept a protective hand on the small of her back as he guided her up a private elevator and into the main living space. The room was expansive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a dark valley, and a massive stone fireplace that was already roaring with a warm fire. "Carmine will secure the perimeter," Denny said, walking over to a crystal decanter on a sidebar. He poured 2 fingers of Macallan 18 and walked back, offering the glass to her. "Drink this. It will help your nerves." Bridget took the glass. Her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She took a sip of the burning liquid, letting it ground her. She looked at Denny, who was watching her with that same quiet intensity he always had in the bakery. "You think I'm a victim in this?" Bridget said suddenly, her voice remarkably clear. Denny paused, a slight frown creasing his brow. "You are a civilian, Bridget. Victor targeted you because he is a coward who preys on vulnerabilities. You were cornered." "I was cornered," she agreed, setting the heavy crystal glass down on a mahogany coffee table. "But I'm not a victim, and I didn't need you to save me just because you think I'm helpless." Denny crossed his arms over his broad chest. "I don't think you are helpless. I think you are the strongest woman I have ever met. But you are out of your depth in my world." "Am I?" Bridget challenged. She reached for her small black velvet evening clutch resting on the sofa. She opened the clasp. Denny watched her, curious but relaxed. Bridget reached into the silk lining of the bag, her fingers finding a tiny, hidden zipper she had sewn in herself. She unzipped it and pulled out a small metallic object. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger. It was the heavy encrypted titanium flash drive. Denny stared at it, his eyes narrowing. "What is that?" "Victor has been using my catering vans to move cash," Bridget said, her voice steady. "A week ago, I found this hidden in a false bottom of a cooler. Victor forgot it. I took it, and I looked at it." Denny stepped closer, his entire demeanor shifting from protective guardian to the lethal head of the Barlow Syndicate. "You decrypted a Rossi drive?" "He's an idiot. He taped the password to the back," Bridget said with a dry, humorless chuckle. "Denny, it's everything. It's his offshore accounts. It's the payroll for the corrupt judges. But more importantly," she took a deep breath, looking him dead in the eye, "it contains the blueprints to your shipping yards in Newark and a detailed plan of attack. He's planning to hit you next Thursday." For a long moment, the only sound in the cavernous room was the crackle of the fire. Denny stared at the drive, then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. He looked at this beautiful, soft, plus-sized woman in an emerald gown, realizing she had been walking around for a week with the holy grail of his enemy's empire tucked into her purse. She hadn't run. She hadn't panicked. She had outsmarted Victor Rossi. A slow, terrifying, deeply genuine smile spread across Dennis's face. It transformed him, making him look younger, more feral, and incredibly dangerous. "You stole Victor Rossi's entire empire," Denny murmured, stepping so close she could feel his breath on her face. "I secured an insurance policy," Bridget corrected, holding the drive out to him. "I was going to find a way to give it to you. Tonight just sped up the timeline." Denny didn't take the drive. Instead, he reached out and gently cupped her face in his large, scarred hands. His thumbs stroked her soft cheeks, reverence radiating from him in waves. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that bordered on obsession. "He thought you were just a soft, fat baker he could push around, and you held a knife to his throat without him even knowing it." Bridget's breath caught in her throat. The way he said fat wasn't an insult. It wasn't a fetish. It was just a fact of her, a part of the magnificent whole he was looking at. "Are we going to stop him?" Bridget asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Denny finally took the flash drive from her fingers, tossing it carelessly onto the table. He didn't care about the drive right now. He pulled her flush against his solid body. "We," Denny said, his lips brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity straight down her spine, "are going to destroy him." Morning broke over the Catskills in a wash of pale gold and slate grey, the heavy rain from the night before giving way to a crisp, biting chill. Inside the brutalist mountain fortress, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the serene wilderness outside. It was a war room. Bridget awoke in the master suite, tangled in sheets of Egyptian cotton that smelled intoxicatingly of cedarwood and Denis. She was wearing one of his spare dress shirts, a crisp white Tom Ford button-down that draped over her wide hips and fell to her mid-thigh. For a long moment, she stared at the sprawling canopy of the pine forest through the floor-to-ceiling windows, wrapping her mind around the reality of her situation. She had stolen from the mob. She had been claimed by a syndicate kingpin, and she was entirely, terrifically calm. She padded barefoot out of the bedroom and navigated the massive glass corridors until she found the kitchen. It was a chef's dream. Industrial wolf ranges, double convection ovens, and yards of pristine black marble countertops. Cooking was Bridget's anchor. Whenever the world spun out of control, she measured flour. She weighed butter. She created order from chaos. By the time Denny and his men emerged from the lower-level security bunker 2 hours later, the stark, masculine safehouse smelled of blooming yeast, caramelized butter, and dark espresso. Denny stopped in the doorway, momentarily paralyzed by the domesticity of the scene. Carmine and Dante, his two most trusted capos, halted right behind him. Bridget was humming softly to herself, her thick, dark hair pulled up into a messy bun. She was pulling a tray of golden, perfectly braided brioche from the oven. The white dress shirt clung to the soft, generous curves of her body, completely transforming the cold, untouchable aura of his fortress into a home. "Good morning," Bridget said, setting the heavy tray down on a cooling rack. She didn't flinch at the sight of the shoulder holsters strapped over the men's chests. "I hope you like your coffee black. I didn't have time to make syrup." Carmine, a man who had broken kneecaps with a tire iron the week prior, looked at the fresh pastries with genuine awe. Is that prosciutto and smoked provolone baked into the bread?" "It is," Bridget smiled, tossing him a clean linen towel. "Help yourself." Denny moved across the kitchen, closing the distance between them. He didn't look at the food. His dark, intense gaze was fixed entirely on her. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing a smudge of flour from her cheek. The intimacy of the gesture, performed right in front of his most lethal enforcers, sent a clear, unspoken message. She was the undisputed queen of this house. "You didn't sleep much," Denny murmured, his voice a low gravel that sent a shiver down her spine. "Neither did you," she countered, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the tight set of his jaw. "Did you decrypt the rest of the drive?" Denny nodded, his expression hardening. "Dante cracked the secondary partitions an hour ago. We need to look at the logistics of his attack on the Newark ports." 10 minutes later, the kitchen island had been cleared of baking supplies and replaced with glowing tablets and holographic schematics. Bridget stood beside Denny, her hip brushing against his thigh as they looked at the digital map of the New York and New Jersey coastlines. Dante, a wiry man with a brilliant, calculating mind, was tapping frantically on a keyboard. "Victor's plan is aggressive, but it's sloppy," Dante explained, pointing to a series of red markers on the map. "He's planning to move 50 heavily armed men into the Newark shipping yards by bypassing the main gate. The drive shows he's bribed the night shift harbor master to turn a blind eye to 3 unmarked commercial vehicles." Carmine scowled, chewing on a piece of brioche. "3 trucks won't hold 50 men, and the artillery they need to take the port. The way station sensors will flag the suspension drop. They'll get stopped before they even hit the docks." Bridget leaned over the tablet, her brow furrowing. She looked at the registration numbers Dante had pulled from Victor's logistics file. A cold realization washed over her. "Those aren't unmarked trucks," Bridget said quietly. Denny turned to her, his full attention snapping to her words. "What do you mean, mea cara?" "Those VIN numbers," she pointed a soft, flour-dusted finger at the screen. "I know them. Those are the refrigerated catering vans he forced me to lease under the Golden Crumbs LLC. They're my bakery's vans." Carmine cursed under his breath. "He's using a legitimate business front. The harbor master knows the catering company. They deliver to the port offices twice a week. They won't even search them." "But Carmine is right," Bridget continued, her mind racing, slipping into the logistical mindset she used to manage her supply chains. "The suspension on those specific Ford Transit models is terrible. I can barely load them with 3 tiered wedding cakes and commercial ice chests without the chassis bottoming out. If he puts 50 men and guns in there, the tires will blow on the turnpike." Dennis's eyes darkened with predatory realization. "He's not moving men in those vans. He's moving explosives," Bridget confirmed, looking up at him, her heart pounding. "He doesn't want to take the port, Dennis. He wants to level it. He wants to destroy your shipping infrastructure entirely. If those vans are packed with C4 and driven into the main terminal, it won't matter how many men you have guarding the gates." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the kitchen. If Bridget hadn't known the weight limits of her own bakery vans, Denny would have sent his enforcers to intercept an armed raid, only to have them walk into a massive, remote detonated bomb. Dante slowly took off his glasses, looking at Bridget with profound respect. "She just saved our entire Eastern operation, boss." Denny didn't say a word. He grabbed Bridget by the hips, hoisted her effortlessly onto the cool marble countertop, and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a raw, bruising collision of teeth and heat, fueled by adrenaline and a terrifying, possessive relief. Bridget gasped against his mouth, her hands instinctively wrapping around his thick neck, her fingers twisting into the dark hair at the nape of his neck. He tasted of dark roast coffee and danger. Denny pressed his solid, muscular frame between her thighs, completely consuming her, branding her as his own in front of his men. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes burning with a dark, fervent fire. "You," Denny whispered fiercely, "are the most dangerous thing I have ever brought into my life." "Good," Bridget breathed back, her chest heaving. Because we're going to need to be dangerous to stop him. The revelation of the bomb plot shifted the atmosphere in the safe house from defensive to violently offensive. For the next 12 hours, Denny and his capos turned the mountain retreat into a tactical command center. Weapons were cleaned, routes were mapped, and millions of dollars were quietly moved through offshore accounts to bribe Victor Rossi's pawns out from under him. Bridget remained in the thick of it. She didn't retreat to the bedroom. She sat at the grand mahogany dining table, her laptop open alongside theirs, cross-referencing Victor's supply receipts from the flash drive with her own catering records to pinpoint exactly where the explosives were being assembled. It was nearing midnight when Dante let out a sharp, confused breath. "Boss," Dante called out, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "I'm tracing the offshore routing numbers Victor used to pay the corrupt judges. Most of them bounce through the Caymans, but one of these shell companies. It's pinging back to a local IP address." Denny walked over, his face unreadable. "Where?" "Here," Dante said, the blood draining from his face. "Not just New York. I mean here. The digital signature on the encrypted payroll account matches a secondary phone pinging off the localized cell tower on this mountain. Someone in our crew has a Rossi payroll account." The air in the room froze. Bridget looked up, her pulse spiking. There were only 20 men guarding the Catskills estate, all hand-picked by Carmine. "Isolate the ping," Denny ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. It was the same tone he had used at the gala. "It's inside the house," Dante typed frantically. "Lower level, moving toward the stairwell, moving fast." Before Dennis could draw his weapon, the heavy oak doors to the dining room burst open. It was Lorenzo, one of the younger perimeter guards who had been standing watch by the garage. But he wasn't standing at attention. He had his Glock 19 drawn, his hands shaking slightly, a wild, desperate look in his eyes. "Don't move! Nobody move!" Lorenzo screamed, swinging the barrel of the gun frantically between Dante, Carmine, and Dennis. Carmine and Denny had their weapons drawn in a fraction of a second, but Lorenzo had anticipated it. He didn't aim at the men who could kill him. He lunged forward, grabbing Bridget by the collar of her silk blouse and yanking her out of her chair. Bridget cried out as Lorenzo shoved the cold, hard barrel of the Glock roughly against her temple. He wrapped a thick arm around her throat, pulling her generous frame in front of him as a human shield. "Drop them!" Lorenzo yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Drop the guns or I blow her brains all over the mahogany." Bridget's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The metallic smell of the gun oil mixed with the scent of Lorenzo's terrified sweat. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, forcing herself not to panic. She was a woman who commanded boiling sugar and razor-sharp knives daily. She refused to die trembling for a coward. "Lorenzo," Denny said. The sound of his voice was a physical weight in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was saturated with a demonic, absolute promise of violence. Denny stood entirely still, his weapon raised, his dark eyes locked onto Lorenzo's with the intensity of a predator viewing its dead prey. "You are going to take the gun away from her head," Denny said slowly, enunciating every syllable. "And if you do, I promise I will make your death quick. If you pull that trigger, I will keep you alive in the basement of this house for a year, and you will beg me for the mercy of hell." "Victor knows she's here," Lorenzo stammered, pulling Bridget tighter against him, choking off her air. "He paid me to drop the firewall on the perimeter cameras. His men are already at the bottom of the mountain. You're dead, Barlow. It's over." Bridget opened her eyes. She saw the microscopic shift in Dennis's stance. She saw Carmine subtly step to the left, drawing Lorenzo's panicked gaze for a fraction of a millisecond. That was all Denny needed. The suppressed gunshot was a sharp, biting pft in the large room. Bridget felt a sudden, wet mist spray across the side of her face. The arm around her throat went instantly slack. Lorenzo's body collapsed backward like a marionette with its strings brutally severed, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. A perfect, symmetrical hole had been punched straight through the center of his forehead. Bridget stood frozen, her chest heaving, staring down at the dead man. The pristine world of her bakery felt 1,000,000 light years away. This was the reality of the man she had tied herself to. Blood, betrayal, and instantaneous death. Dennis was across the room in 2 strides. He kicked the gun away from Lorenzo's lifeless hand and pulled Bridget into his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his massive hands roaming over her back, her arms, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice thick with a raw, desperate fear that he only ever showed for her. "Bridget, look at me. Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, her hands trembling as she grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket. "I'm okay. Dennis, I'm okay." He let out a ragged breath, pulling out a crisp linen handkerchief and gently wiping the blood spatter from her cheek. His hands, which had just ended a man's life without a second thought, were infinitely gentle against her soft skin. "He said Victor's men are at the bottom of the mountain," Bridget said, forcing her mind past the shock, prioritizing survival. "We need to leave." Dennis's eyes darkened, the brief flash of vulnerability vanishing, replaced by the cold, calculating kingpin. He looked down at Lorenzo's body, then back to Dante. "Victor thinks he's catching us blind," Dennis said, a ruthless smile playing on his lips. "He thinks he's ambushing this safe house while his bomb trucks roll into Newark unchecked." "What's the play, boss?" Carmine asked, racking the slide of his assault rifle. "We don't run," Denny commanded. "Dante, use Lorenzo's phone. Text Victor. Tell him Lorenzo has secured the girl and locked us in the bunker. Tell him to send his advance team up the driveway." Bridget looked at Dennis, her eyes wide. "You're inviting them in?" "I am going to slaughter them," Denny said plainly, his gaze locking with hers. "And while Victor is busy watching his men die on my mountain, Carmine is going to take a team to Newark and intercept those catering vans. We are going to sever the head of the Rossi family tonight." Denny turned back to Bridget, cupping her face. "I need you to go into the subterranean panic room with Dante. It is reinforced steel. Nothing gets through those doors." "No," Bridget said firmly, surprising even herself. Denny frowned. "Bridget, this is not a negotiation. There is going to be a bloodbath in this house." "And Victor is targeting me," Bridget countered, placing her hands flat against Dennis's chest. "If he realizes I'm not up here, he might pull his men back. He wants the flash drive, and he wants to punish me. I am the bait, Denny. Let me be the bait." Dennis stared at the defiant, beautiful, magnificent woman standing before him. She was terrified, yet she was standing in a room with a dead body, offering to help him spring a trap on the most vicious mafia underboss in New York. She wasn't just a baker anymore. She was a Barlow. "You stay behind the bulletproof glass of the overlooking mezzanine," Denny finally conceded, his voice heavy with pride and anxiety. "If a single piece of glass shatters, you run for the bunker. Understand?" "Understood," Bridget nodded. Denny leaned down and kissed her one last time, a harsh, bruising promise of victory. "Let's go welcome Victor's men to the Catskills," The silence that blanketed the Catskills estate was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with lethal anticipation. Bridget stood behind the reinforced, 2-inch thick bulletproof glass of the overlooking mezzanine. From this vantage point, she had a panoramic view of the grand foyer below, a sprawling expanse of imported Italian slate and minimalist steel architecture. Her heart drummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were entirely steady as they rested against the cool glass. She was still wearing Dennis's oversized white dress shirt, the fabric draping elegantly over her wide hips and thick thighs, a stark contrast to the tactical darkness consuming the house. Dante stood a few paces behind her in the shadows, an assault rifle resting comfortably against his shoulder, his eyes darting between the security monitors on his tablet and the floor below. Down in the foyer, the trap was set. Denny and his remaining men had melted into the architecture, invisible in the strategic blind spots of the room. The grand oak doors were unlocked. "Carmine is in position at the Newark ports," Dante whispered into his earpiece, relaying the information to Denny below, though his voice was barely a breath in the quiet mezzanine. "He has eyes on the 3 catering vans. They just bypassed the way station, exactly as Bridget predicted." Bridget held her breath. If Carmine failed, Dennis's empire would be crippled in a fiery instant. Outside, the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway shattered the mountain stillness. Victor Rossi's advance team had arrived. Thinking the perimeter defenses were down and the house was secured by their mole, they didn't employ stealth. They were arrogant, storming the front steps with the clumsy confidence of men who believed the war was already won. The heavy oak doors were kicked open. 12 heavily armed Rossi enforcers flooded into the grand foyer, their tactical flashlights slicing through the gloom. They fanned out, their boots heavy on the slate, weapons raised as they moved toward the main living area, expecting to find Dennis Barlow zip-tied and waiting for execution. They found ghosts instead. From her elevated sanctuary, Bridget watched the maestro conduct his symphony of violence. Dennis stepped out from behind a colossal stone pillar, his customized matte black Kimber 1911 already raised. He didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a monologue. He simply fired. The ensuing chaos was a masterclass in tactical superiority. Dennis's men opened fire from 3 different elevated blind spots. The foyer erupted in a deafening cacophony of suppressed gunfire, shattering glass from decorative vases and the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the floor. It was over in less than 40 seconds. The Rossi advance team was completely decimated, caught in a flawless, inescapable crossfire. Bridget didn't flinch. She watched Denny move methodically through the fallen men, his large, powerful frame moving with a terrifying grace, ensuring the threat was entirely neutralized. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Bridget through the bulletproof glass. Even across the distance and through the haze of gun smoke, the possessive, protective heat in his gaze made her breath catch. Suddenly, Dante's tablet chirped violently. "Boss," Dante called out, leaning over the mezzanine railing. "Carmine just checked in from Newark. He breached the catering vans at the port checkpoint." Down below, Denny halted, his earpiece crackling. "Status?" "Bridget was right," Dante relayed, a breathless grin spreading across his face. "The chassis on those Fords were screaming. Carmine's men disabled the drivers before they reached the terminal gates. The cargo holds were packed to the ceiling with C4 wired to remote detonators. The bomb squad is disarming them now. The ports are secure." A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the Barlow men. Bridget leaned her forehead against the glass, closing her eyes as a wave of profound relief washed over her. She had done it. The soft, fat baker from Brooklyn had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar terrorist plot. But the night wasn't over. "Dante," Dennis's voice crackled over the comms, cold and deadly. "Victor wouldn't have stayed in the city. He's too vain. He wants to watch me die." "Pinging Lorenzo's phone again," Dante said, his fingers flying across his screen. "We have a secondary signal. A heavily armored SUV is approaching the main gate. It's him. Victor is coming up the mountain." "Kill the exterior floodlights," Dennis ordered, racking a fresh magazine into his handgun. "Open the gates. Let the rat warthouse walk into the trap." The estate plunged into absolute darkness, save for the faint, silvery moonlight spilling through the skylights. Bridget gripped the railing, her pulse surging once again. Minutes later, a black, armored Cadillac Escalade rolled slowly up the winding driveway, its headlights cutting through the heavy fog rolling off the mountain. It parked squarely in front of the open oak doors. The driver, seeing the bodies of the advance team littering the foyer steps, threw the SUV into reverse in a blind panic. But Dennis's men were already behind them. Spike strips, deployed from the shadows of the garage, shredded the Escalade's reinforced tires with a series of sharp, explosive pops. Before the driver could accelerate on the rims, two of Dennis's capos blew the hinges off the driver's side door with breaching rounds, dragging the screaming driver into the gravel. The back door of the SUV was kicked open from the inside. Victor Rossi stumbled out, clutching a submachine gun. His designer suit rumpled and his face pale with frantic realization. He spun around, trying to find a target in the darkness, but he was instantly surrounded by the blinding beams of half a dozen tactical flashlights. "Put it down, Victor," Dennis's voice boomed from the front steps of the estate. Victor froze, squinting against the harsh light. Denny walked slowly down the stone steps, a towering monolith of lethal authority. The silver scar on his jaw caught the moonlight, making him look every inch the ruthless underworld king he was. "Barlow," Victor spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You think you've won? My men are leveling your ports right now." "Your men," Dennis corrected softly, stopping 3 feet away from the Rossi underboss, "are currently chained to a chain-link fence in Newark, watching my bomb squad dismantle your pathetic attempt at a coup." Victor's jaw dropped, the submachine gun slipping slightly in his sweaty palms. "Impossible. The harbor master was bypassed," Denny interrupted, "because you made a fatal error in your logistics, Victor. You underestimated the intelligence of the woman you tried to terrorize." Denny gestured up toward the house. Bridget stepped out from the shadows of the grand foyer, walking slowly down the front steps. She had traded the oversized dress shirt for her emerald silk gown from the night before, her thick, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She moved with an undeniable, majestic grace, her lush curves cutting a commanding silhouette against the carnage around her. She didn't look like a terrified hostage. She looked like a queen descending from her throne. Victor stared at her, his eyes bulging in disbelief. You told him about the vans?" "I know my business, Victor," Bridget said, her voice clear and carrying over the cool mountain air. "I know how much weight my vans can carry, and I know a coward when I see one." "You fat bitch," Victor snarled, raising the weapon toward her in a desperate, suicidal final play. He didn't even get his finger on the trigger. Denny moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He stepped into Victor's guard, his massive left hand clamping down over the barrel of the submachine gun, forcing it toward the sky. With his right hand, Denny drove the butt of his kimber into Victor's nose with the force of a freight train. Bone shattered with a sickening crunch. Victor screamed, dropping the weapon and falling to his knees on the gravel, clutching his ruined face as blood poured between his fingers. Denny stood over him, radiating a dark, volcanic fury. He aimed the barrel of his gun directly at the back of Victor's skull. "You threatened her business," Dennis said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural growl. "You put your hands on her in public. You brought a war to my doorstep. But your greatest sin, Victor, was believing for a single second that she was anything less than extraordinary." Victor sobbed, spitting blood onto the gravel. "Dennis, please. The commission, the families won't allow this. You can't kill an underboss without a sit-down." "The commission will thank me for excising a rabid dog who plotted to bomb a civilian port," Dennis replied coldly. "Look at her, Victor." Victor, trembling violently, tilted his ruined face up to look at Bridget. Bridget stood beside Denny, looking down at the man who had tormented her for weeks. She felt no pity. She felt no fear. The years of shrinking herself, of apologizing for taking up space, of letting cruel men dictate her worth, it all evaporated in the cool mountain breeze. She was magnificent. She was powerful. And she was loved by a monster who would burn the world down to keep her warm. "Get out of my city," Bridget said quietly, the final verdict falling from her lips. Denny looked at Bridget, his chest swelling with dark pride. She wasn't just his anchor. She was his equal. "You heard the lady," Denny said to Victor. "You are dead in New York. You will be on a private jet to South America within the hour, courtesy of my men. If you ever return, if you ever breathe a word of her name, I will not just kill you. I will erase your entire bloodline. Do you understand?" Victor nodded frantically, weeping into the dirt. Denny waved his hand. Two of his massive enforcers hauled Victor off the ground by his armpits, dragging the broken man toward one of the waiting SUVs. The siege was over. The war was won before it even officially began. Denny holstered his weapon and turned to Bridget. The cold, merciless mob boss vanished entirely, replaced by a man looking at a goddess. He reached out, his large hand settling firmly on her wide, soft hips, pulling her flush against his solid body. "You," Denny murmured, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of vanilla and gunpowder that clung to her skin. "You are my absolute ruin." Bridget wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, her fingers threading into his dark hair. She felt the heavy, frantic beating of his heart against her chest. "I think I'm your salvation, Denny," she whispered back, pressing a kiss to his scarred jaw. 6 months later, the Golden Crumb was no longer just a quaint bakery in Williamsburg. It was the flagship of a massive, thriving culinary empire spanning the 5 boroughs. The Rossi family had completely collapsed, their territories quietly absorbed by the Barlow Syndicate, ushering in an era of unprecedented, iron-fisted peace in the New York underworld. And at the center of it all was Bridget. She stood in the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen of her new Manhattan headquarters, humming happily as she pulled a tray of dark chocolate and blood-orange tarts from the commercial oven. She wore a custom-tailored chef's coat that hugged her generous curves perfectly, a diamond the size of a small boulder flashing on her left ring finger. The heavy kitchen doors swung open, and the ambient noise of the bustling bakery went instantly dead silent. Dennis Barlow walked in, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, moving with that same quiet, predatory grace. His men waited outside. He didn't care about the flour on the counters or the heat of the ovens. He walked straight up to his wife, pulling her into a deep, possessive kiss that left her breathless and flushed. "Black coffee?" Bridget asked, smiling up at the most dangerous man in the city. "And whatever you are most proud of baking this morning," Dennis replied, his dark eyes tracing the magnificent, unapologetic shape of her body. "Because, Mea Regina, I am ravenous." Bridget laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that echoed over the marble counters. She handed him a tart, knowing with absolute certainty that she had finally found a man who would never ask her to be anything less than entirely powerfully full. "Thank you so much for diving into this thrilling mafia romance. If you enjoyed the tension, the twists, and watching our magnificent, brilliant baker completely outsmart the underworld to claim her throne, please like this video and share it with your fellow romance and drama lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on more gripping, high-stakes stories just like this one. Drop a comment below telling us what your favorite moment was. We love hearing from you. See you in the next story.